Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the HERC External Seminar Series. And this time we have David Palacios from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And he's going to present his work about going beyond randomized control trial to assess the treatment effect heterogeneity across target population. And before he starts, let me just briefly introduce him. So David is a health economist with a focus on policy evaluation and applied microeconometrics. He joined the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine as an assistant professor in 2020, and he co-leads the policy evaluation team within the Global Health Economics Center. He's also an honorary research fellow at Imperial College London and a visiting senior fellow at LSE. And he also has a professional experience in both the public and the private sectors in Mexico, including the Ministry of Finance of the Mexico City government and the Ministry of Social Development. And he also worked as a consultant in a consultancy firm specializing in public finance. And very welcome, David. And I think now the floor is yours.
Thanks. And well, you will see here we have a long list of authors, and this is one of the themes that literally every author did something. Indeed, so one of the authors, co-authors, is present today here, Amanda. So it's a really nice. It's part of a bigger project. This paper, which is the Permit project, where I'll go a bit. And this is already published in Health Economics, and yeah. So yes, the way I structure the presentation is I will talk. I mean, we could go and stay talking about the methods the whole day. So this is not. I mean, I will go briefly to the methods, but I will perhaps go not much into detail because we have a few. Two basically methodological approaches that are not that common. They are becoming more common in causal inference. This is the agenda for today. Well, the motivation is that, well, as you may know, decision-making agencies across the world require evidence on relative effectiveness and cost-effectiveness for the populations and subpopulations of direct relevance for the decision problem. But usually, this evidence comes from RCTs, which are generally or typically insufficient to address the decision problem because, just by definition and by design, they exclude patients or individuals that are actually where the uncertainty of the treatment relies, and they are all essentially different from the patients that are seen or are seeking healthcare in the routine practice. And as you may know, there have been huge improvements both in the quality of data and in the availability of data that give electronic health records the opportunity to offer or to provide estimates of treatment effects relevant to subgroups, in particular those that are explicitly excluded from RCTs. And this is pretty much what we exploit here at Rich Dataset. And we have also been more recently in the last 5 years perhaps, there have been some methods that have been developed for transporting results from RCTs to the target populations. And please note that here we are using the verb transport and non-generalize. So the difference between generalization and transportability, or generalizability and transportability, means that we talk about generalizability when we want to do inference on the population that meet the eligibility criteria of the study, but that didn't make it right to the study, are not included in the study. But we talk about transportability to also when we want to make inference, the population that do not meet the eligibility criteria of the study or the RCT, but we still are populations, also populations of interest for the decision problem. So that's the difference between transportability and the generalizability. And there have been a few methods that have been developed in this, but they mostly account for differences in observed characteristics, both from the RCTs and in the electronic health records. But there's a concern that RCT participation may also reflect on measured characteristics in both RCTs and in electronic health records. For example, preferences, frailty, diet, attitude to risk that are not always captured, as I said, both in RCTs and in electronic health records. And the problem here is that if these unmeasured characteristics are associated with RCT participation, they may modify the relative effectiveness of the treatments that we are comparing. And if this is true, we have essential heterogeneity. That this is an additional problem from measure confounding. So it's kind of a double bias if we don't take into account this. So, well, as some of you may know, especially if you work with RCTs or non-randomized studies, one of the main challenges when we are using non-randomized studies is confounding by indication. Now that we see that patient A receives treatment A and that patient B receives treatment B, but there may be some prognostic characteristics that are actually very reasonable for what each patient receives their own. But we as analysts, we don't necessarily observe those. And if we don't take these into account, then our estimates would be biased. And in order to account for this or to try to address this challenge, one of the methods that have been developed is that of the target trial framework that you may have heard, developed by Miguel Hernan and colleagues. That basically is they conceptualize a non-randomized study as if it were an RCT, in order to take into account at least partly of some of these confounding by indication by defining a population with very clear inclusion and exclusion criteria as if it were an RCT. No, we also have to be very clear which are the treatments that we are comparing. And importantly, there's something called in target trial jargon is time zero. So time zero is equivalent to the point of randomization, and this means that when all the eligibility criteria from the population in our electronic health records are met and the treatment is assigned. So this is a key decision when we are designing a target trial. And now going through the objectives of this study in particular. So first we want to examine or to use this framework to examine heterogeneity in treatment effects. And we argue that this method accounts for both unobserved confounding and essential heterogeneity, and then we will apply these methods to a case study in type 2 diabetes mellitus, which I'll give a bit more detail in a sec. So the method that we use to account for both essential heterogeneity and unobserved confounding is a development of instrumental variables that is called local instrumental variables. Well, it's a bit technical, but I promise it will not be super technical, although if people want to go more into the technical, I'm happy to. But basically, we define or we start from the Neyman Rowling potential outcomes framework, where we have Y1 and Y0 are the potential outcomes under treatment and non-treatment, and that they depend on a vector of observables given by XO and unobservables given by XU, and a random unmeasured variation given by theta. And for this we have to define an index measure, an index model for the treatment. So how is treatment assigned? That is dependent on observables and instruments, that I will go a bit to detail what an instrument is, and something on measure that is, let's say, going against the treatment or the probability of treatment. And this is perhaps clearer if we define this index model in terms of probabilities or a propensity. So we define the propensity score matching. Can you see my mouse? Yeah. So we define the propensity score matching as a function of observables and an instrument. And this basically reflects the degree to which measure confounders and these instruments encourage treatment, the treatment of interest. And we have here a component given by V that measures the extent to which unmeasured confounders, that reflects the extent to which unmeasured confounders discourage treatment. So it goes against the propensity score matcher that we have previously estimated. And on the regular IV assumptions, Heckman, which was a Nobel Prize in economics, says that we can estimate marginal treatment effects by taking the derivative with respect to the propensity score. Both one of our co-authors and Ivan Basu take this idea of Heckman of marginal treatment effects and introduce what is known as the person-centered treatment effects, or PETs. And basically what this approach does is it averages the marginal treatment estimates over a plausible distribution of unobserved characteristics. So how do we do that? So what Anirban says is that we can estimate the propensity, the propensity score matching, the propensity score, but we also have the actual observed decision. So we can start comparing how different levels of the propensity score and how for marginal changes in the propensity score, how is the observed decision, the observed treatment changing? And by comparing these two, how they change together, we can do some inference or assumptions, or we can identify a distribution of unobservable characteristics that may be pushing an individual away from the treatment of interest. And these are the PET effects. So basically, we can identify individual effects at the individual level, and therefore they are more nuanced than the conditional average treatment effects. That's basically the aggregated at subgroup levels. Now, I will explain briefly a bit more on the target trial, or the approach we took the target trial, rather. So we applied the same restrictive eligibility criteria of a published RCT. So we did a lit review, found an RCT that we could emulate using, I will explain a bit later, CPRD in this case, which is, I will give more details, so with our electronic health records. And we defined as a subgroup of interest that we call the RCT eligible population. And this means the population that met the criteria of this pivotal trial. Then we use this pivotal trial as an experimental benchmark to see how our methodological approach based on electronic health records can emulate the results obtained by the RCT. And interestingly, we will also pre-specify additional subgroup of interests for decision making that were not necessarily included in the RCT of reference, with a special interest in multimorbid patients that are a particular subgroup of interest in diabetes. And usually, for doing this, you have to take follow some analytical methods to address the confounding, and in our case was the local ID, what I explained briefly. One of the advantages of this approach is that we can also not only define additional subgroups of interest to work to those different to those defined in the RCT, but we could also consider additional outcomes and endpoints to the one reported in the RCT. So, going more into what we can do with the target trial is once we have defined our eligibility criteria, we can apply that eligibility criteria to an electronic health record or data. We can compare the baseline characteristics of the RCT or the published RCT with ours to see if there's any imbalance that would suggest that we are not capturing the same population. And we could also, well, once we do our estimation, or apply our estimation strategy, so these methods, as opposed to the traditional IB, this method identifies average treatment effect if you aggregate all your individual treatment effects at population level, which the average treatment effect is also the estimate identified by RCTs. So then you can compare like to like the treatment effect estimates from the RCT to the one with our method. And to conclude whether we emulate the results, we use a metric suggested by Franklin that is called the estimate metric, that basically says that if the treatment effect estimate from our non-randomized study is within the 95% confidence interval of the RCT1, then we have reached an agreement. But it's important to emphasize and to clarify that the fact that we actually agree or reach estimate agreement doesn't necessarily imply that the underlying assumptions of our methods are met or are valid. But it is useful to highlight settings where there are big discrepancies between following these methods and the results of following this method and the results from RCT. But we should also be conscious about what are the potential sources of differences between our methods or results from our methods and an RCT, as our reason of finding discrepancies would be that the assumptions in our method are simply not valid, but could also be that there are unmet methodological challenges. For example, could be that we didn't address correctly, like missing values, or there were some measurement errors, or there's also the possibility, or there's very likely, well, not likely, but typical, that you cannot always emulate everything that happens in RCT. For example, when you try to, before some patients go before, like, how do you call it, the moderation, before they start the actual treatment. So you cannot emulate that using real world data. But I think one of the important contributions of this paper is that we identified two subpopulations of interest. As I said, those that are that met the criteria of a published RCT, and we define it as RCT eligible, but also those that didn't meet the criteria, not those that are left behind from the RCT and will not be considered in most RCTs, which we define as RCT ineligible. And it's also interesting to compare the age of these subpopulations to see how much a treatment impacts different populations that are in principle targets of these treatments, but basically they would not have been included in an RCT had this been rolled out. But we can also compare conditional average treatment effects of the target population. The target population is made up of the RCT eligible, the RCT ineligible, and so we can do all these three-way comparisons. Now I will talk a bit briefly about the case study, which is the permit study. that has an interest in assessing comparative effectiveness in second-line antidiabetics. PERMI projects included the three most important second-line oral antidiabetics that are DPP-4Is, SUs. Sorry, I will not go and define them because I cannot basically pronounce it. And there's a third class that is not included in this paper, that is SGLT2Is. So, but in this paper, we only focused on DPP-4Is versus SUs because they were the main second-line treatments prescribed in the UK between 2011 and 2015. That is the study period of our study, and we use CPRD data. For those of you that are not familiar with CPRD, this is basically records from the GP, for GP practice covering up to around 20% of the population. They are representative in terms of age and sex, and they include information of primary care, such as clinical and demographic characteristics, clinical diagnosis, laboratory test results, prescriptions, and they could be linked with other data sets, including HERC. And for continuing with our methodological approach, I said that we went through a literature review. We found that the Knock et al. Study was one that we could emulate using CPRD. So just for completeness, so Knock et al. I will just describe briefly Knock et al. That is a multinational parallel RCT that it compared precisely the two drugs of interest in our case, and the outcome of interest was HbA1c at 1 year, which was one of the variables that were recorded in CPRD as well. So basically, we could have data on that, on the eligibility criteria, and we could also emulate the different treatment strategies of interest. And we emulated treatment randomization using local instrumental variables. That's one that I described briefly before, and a sensitivity analysis, another method that has different assumptions, that assumes that there is no unmeasured confounding, which is the inverse probability of treatment weighting with regression adjustment. And the instrument that we use for this is tendency to prescribe. That is basically the proportion of patients in each CCG that were prescribed DPP-4I. We are using CCGs because CCGs were in practice during the time of study. I'm not going through this very small print table, but I just want to show it, the type of decisions that goes into designing a target trial. So we have to be clear of which are our inclusion criteria, our exclusion criteria, our treatment strategies, that the two drugs that we are comparing, how we are emulating the assignment criteria that I described with local IVs and IPTWs. The day zero, which is an important decision, as I said, here was the day of the first prescription of second-line treatment that would have been with an SU or a DPP-4I. And well, we have the outcome very clear from the beginning. And it's important to say that the causal of interest that we are identifying here is an intention to treat, because of course, we see that the patient was first prescribed, but we don't have really data on the adherence of treatment or whether the patient ended up switching treatments at a later stage. So this is an intention to treat effect when we are identifying. So for those of you that are not familiar with instrumental variables, this is basically how they can be represented. So our instrument, that is a tendency to prescribe, in this case, DPP-4Is, it should be a good predictor of the treatment, to the individual treatment with either DPP-4I or SUs, and should not be related or affecting the outcome of interest, HbA1c at 1 year, through any other channel. we recognize, or the problem why we use instrumental variables is that both treatment assignments and outcomes are subject to the influence of measured confounders and unmeasured confounders, right, unobserved confounders. So this is basically the graphic representation of how the IV works. And going a bit more into detail of our instrument, as I said, is the tendency to prescribe DPP-4Is in the CCG during in the 12 months before each patient starts their own second line, receives their first second line prescription. So this means that every patient that starts second line treatment in different days, even if they are coming from the CCG, from the same CCG, they have different TTPs, tendency to prescribe. So it varies not only across CCGs but also between CCGs. When we take into account the temporal perspective. So we exploited that there's a wide variation across England in the choice of first stage intensification. And well, I'm just going through for completeness from the assumptions that our instrument has to meet in order to be a valid instrument. So it's basically four assumptions. First, it has to be a good predictive of treatment choice. This assumption is tested. It should not be directly associated with the outcome of interest, in this case HbA1c. And this assumption is not testable. We just need to argue. It should not be directly associated. We don't measure characteristics, which again is not testable, but we can give some further assumptions to show how plausible this assumption may be. And something called the monotonicity assumption, that is that the instrument should have the same direction on the effect of the probability of treatment. So that is that patients that live, so if we compare two patients, one that lives or that is registered in a CCG with a high tendency to prescribe and against another with a low tendency to prescribe, the one living in the higher tendency to prescribe has higher likelihood to be prescribed DPP-4I and not the other way around. So this is a monotonicity assumption, and that goes across the country. So I want to give a bit of an intuition behind this local instrumental variable. So I put their marginal patients, and that was another Amanda has been very careful, said we should not be using marginal patients. This was an overlook from my friend. It's marginal, although let's see, I will explain what I meant for marginal patients here. So let's assume for a sec that there exists a group of what we call patients that are, I put here marginal patients, these patients that are marginal to the decision, where the decision is receiving PPP-4I and or SU is that's where why we use marginal. The decision is marginal, the patients are marginal. I'm insisting because I remember that Amanda was very clear about not using, and I think that was
what's called marginal.
So yes, so that means that there's the factors like encouraging DPP-4Is and those encouraging SUs are basically at balance, and like an influence of the instrument may switch them. So, for example, if this patient have changed CCGs previous for him to be prescribed with a second line to a CCG that is higher, has a higher DPP-4I, then the likelihood of being prescribed with DPP-4I is higher, basically. So basically, small changes or marginal changes in the instrumental variable pushes the marginal patient to the different treatment. And this And this change can be attributable to the instrument. So for this, of course, we need a continuous instrumental variable, and that's why tendency to prescribe is a continuous variable, so that we can see the marginal changes. I don't want to show you all the statistics, which I know is a painful graph to analyze, but I just want to highlight two bits. The first two columns are the descriptive statistics reported in the published RCT, and the three other set columns are first from our RCT eligible population, the RCT eligible population, and then the two joined together. And we see that our population from the electronic records are slightly older and have a slightly higher HbA1c at baseline. But apart from those, basically they are very, very comparable. And so in terms of the instrument diagnostics, this graph is just to show that there's a wide variation across the countries, where we basically just, it's an histogram of the tendency to prescribe for all the CCGs that make it to our study. So it's pretty much a lot of variation, and that's a good coverage. So that's what we wanted. So the one assumption that is testable, that is a relevant condition, is that it's a good predictor, that our instrument is a good predictor of treatments. And this can be tested with what we call the F statistic. And as a rule of thumb, the F statistic should be higher than 10 to be considered strong, or some studies have also suggested higher than 100. So as you can see, our instrument is very strong in that sense. Ours is more than 1,000, 1,500, so very strong. So we don't have any concerns from that side. So here what I'm showing here is basically how our instrument is balanced across different levels of observed covariance. And the assumption here is that if the instrument is balanced across measured covariance, the assumption that it's also balanced across unmeasured factors is more plausible. Of course, we cannot test that, but we can offer the reader more elements about the plausibility of this assumption. And the way we see this is that we will expect flat lines across different, and we are arguably finding flat lines with a few exceptions. But the interest here is that we condition for those variables where there's a bit of not completely flat lines. And this is how the actual individual level effects are distributed. So here we make the comparison between those that will have made the RCT, that are colored in red, and those that will have not made the RCT ineligible population, that are transparent here. And the reason I put this graph there is just to highlight the wide variation across which is expected, right? Because those that would have made the RCT, their RCT eligible population, are more homogeneous, right? That is, the individual level effects are like that's very concentrated around zero. But there's higher variation across those that would have not made this RCT, and I think this shows that some evidence of the higher heterogeneity happening, especially on those individuals that would have not made the RCT. Here's comparing the different average treatment effects. So to be fair, the only two that are comparable one-to-one are the first two, which is the first one is that's reported by the published RCT by Nock et al. And so this line, the solid black line, is 0 So that means that if the confidence intervals cross this zero line, there's not statistically significant, but the two dotted red lines is where it's showing clinically significant. So, and this is measuring, the outcome is measuring millimoles per moles. And so if the estimates or if the confidence interval crosses or is beyond, say that is beyond that threshold, is there, we can conclude that it's clinically significant, apart from being statistically significant or not. So what we found first is that these are comparable one-to-one, is that we basically, so both the estimate from the RCT and our estimate for the RCT eligible population cross the significance, or cross zeros, or are insignificant, and they are also within the clinically significant thresholds. So we conclude using this estimate agreement metric proposed by Franklin that we pretty much emulated the results from the RCT. But for completeness, we show the results from the RCT ineligible population, that is the third line here. And we can see that it still crosses the significance or the zero, but it crosses also the clinically significance. But what is perhaps more important is that if you see here the populations of the RCT eligible and the RCT ineligible are pretty much the same, around 6,000, but the variation or the confidence intervals in the RCT ineligible are much wider. So another is suggesting that there's a lot of heterogeneity there. And the last estimate that we are putting here is just basically the aggregation of both the RCT and the RCT. So the RCT eligible and ineligible, and it's still statistically insignificant and crosses just by a bit the clinically significant threshold. So basically what we say, okay, when we compare the average treatment effects, we reach the same conclusion that this RCT reached, is basically the effect of TPP4Is against SUs on HbA1c at 1 year is clinically insignificant. And I will not go, no worries, I will not try to scare any of you, but I'm just showing here how we can, just by aggregating the individual level effects at different pre-specified subgroups of interest, we can basically compare subgroups, how do they, what's the results, not only in the overall target population, but also in the RCT eligible and in the RCT ineligible. And we see that only with exceptions for those in the RCT ineligible, for that basically the obese individuals, this treatment is favoring TPP4Is against its use. But that's pretty much the only group where we see some significant, statistically significant results and clinically significant in the case of the variables. So coming towards the end of my presentation, before finishing, I would like just to share some of the thoughts or reflections we have come with this. And is that, well, we show with the study that the populations, the target populations for decision making, they may differ between those that are eligible for RCTs according to baseline characteristics, but also that can modify relative effectiveness of healthcare interventions. So there's essential heterogeneity going on. And but that using target trial framework combined with instrumental variables, we can address both, and more importantly, we can compare the effects of RCT eligible population against the RCT ineligible population. And well, in our case, we found that the results, our results are similar to those published by the RCT. And when we compare the RCT eligible versus the RCT ineligible population, we notice that both are going in the same direction, but the magnitude of the RCT ineligible are different. And of course, that the variation, as I showed with that first histogram, is much wider or higher across or in the RCT eligible population. I would just want to highlight the three main contributions of what we think is the three main contributions of this paper. So we provide an approach for transporting results from a population eligible for an RCT to a broader target population that accounts for essential heterogeneity. We assess the extent to which heterogeneity differs across subpopulations who met the RCT eligibility criteria to those that did not. And we use a local instrumental variable approach within a target trial framework that can address unobserved confounding and essential heterogeneity. So we think these are the three main contributions of the paper. But of course, we are subject to some limitations. No? So first, before talking about the limitations, I just want to emphasize that it's important to also include in the mix different assumptions, including those that assume non-observed confounding. And I mean, I didn't show the results from IPTW, but they basically are both the same direction, different magnitude. Sorry, not same direction, the same conclusion. Different direction, but same conclusion, not that different. And we need to have in mind what are we comparing, because sometimes some studies use just the standard instrumental variables, but this yield a different estimate, that is the local average stream effects, that is only valid for the compliers. So this and which is a different estimate to the one that RCTs produce. So if we are interested to compare amongst what RCT produces, then we need to be careful of what we are comparing, pairs with pairs and not pairs with apples. And the use of an RCT benchmark is useful in providing support for the underlying assumptions behind the methods. But as I said, it's not an indication that they are met. If we find like agreement between the emulation and the RCT. And the main limitations of this work is that we explore heterogeneity in one clinical scenario, that all the challenges that appear here are not necessarily an exhaustive list of all the challenges that you may find in other settings, clinical practice. The comparators of interest in our case were available from electronic HERC records, but they are not always available from real-world data. Here we consider only a single endpoint, what happened HbA1c at 1 year, but we can easily expand. Well, easily I said with our data, but with other data, it depends on the richness and of the data itself, but it can be principle applied to multiple endpoints, multiple outcomes as well. And you make one of the questions, maybe, yes, you have very wide confidence interval, so it's very inefficient. And so we are working in a different method that combines the consistency of local instrumental variables with the precision of OLS. So stay tuned to this channel right here, back from our group. And yeah, thanks very much, and thanks to all the authors that were very helpful, and I'm very happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, David, for your interesting presentation. I think it's a great work. And is there any questions?
Thanks, David. I really enjoyed your presentation. It's fantastic stuff. I had, I suppose, two questions. Firstly, I didn't quite see it clearly or get it fully, but just in terms of comparing the subgroups, the effects in the subgroups with the RCT versus what you've got. I appreciate that the confidence intervals are wide. But so how much could we say about the sort of similarity in treatment effects across the subgroups? Are there any particular subgroups where it looks particularly promising and others that it doesn't, for instance?
Yes. Can I access? Yeah. So I think, for example, there was one in the, thank you. There was one particularly in the obese. Sorry, there it's a bit too small, but for example, in the ineligible population for the obese, the ones in the very low, here we can see that this treatment is statistically, or the effect is statistically significant, while it is not for the eligible population. And this is, I mean, I don't know if that's what your question was, but it's, I think, yes, I mean, this is, of course, there are other factors that make make those appearing in the second column, being in the second column, and those the same factors making the individuals appear in the third column. So they are different, yes, in other characteristics, but when compare the very obese against the very obese, then they go in statistically significant different directions. I don't know if that's what you're saying.
Well, I mean, that's also very interesting. But what I was actually thinking more was within the eligible populations.
Okay.
So I suppose where I'm sort of going with this is, so one of the big issues in RCTs is the lack of, as you mentioned right at the start, the lack of diversity and the certain subgroups are just underrepresented. So I suppose what would be really compelling evidence to me that this can do a great job of getting around that issue in a way would be that if you found for the groups that there is enough data in RCTs, if you're able to compare the subgroup analysis in Europe with that, as they all look pretty consistent, then, but you can't be sure that it's going to be true for the groups that actually were, that we weren't able to get on the RCTs, but it would give quite compelling evidence that maybe, we could rely on. So I appreciate this is the start of a big agenda for that, but I suppose that's what I would really love to see going forward. So I don't know if is there much that you can say about that, do you think, so far?
So I think, I'm not sure, but maybe I'm not understanding your point, because for me it makes a bit of this contrast goes in that direction, right? That it says, okay, we have people that make the RCT and people that did not make the RCT. How do they differ across other measure groupings? So but that's not what you're going, or that's not.
That was sort of where I was going actually, but within the eligible rather than the ineligible. So within the parameters,
okay,
you were actually trying to get in the RCT, but you didn't manage to get because you didn't try hard enough for that rules.
But then, so what? I mean, there are methods for where you can. That's when the generalizability and transportability comes into play, right? Like, so if in a well-designed RCT or in a well-designed non-randomized study, that we can generalize the results to the people meeting the criteria, but that didn't make to the study because maybe didn't have enough, it was not big enough, the data set for the RCT, didn't have enough funds to include more people. So then we can, if under the assumption that they were well designed, then you can generalize those results to that population. But if you want to make inferences to the population that would have not made that RCT, but not because of they didn't have, not because of budget or time constraints, but because of actually design criteria, then what we need the transportability concept and methods for that.
Great. No, that's absolutely great. Thank you. Can I ask just one other quick question? So just on the instrument, so the propensity to treat. Well, what's that based on? Is it all medications or is this medication?
No, it's only the for second line antidiabetics. That during 2011 and 2015 there were, I think, I'm not correct here, but it's around 90% or 80, around 90% of all second-line treatment prescriptions were just these two. When we talk about oral second-line treatments.
Right, and it's the like proportion to not. It's the
And yes, exactly. It's just take it. So our end denominator is all patients that received a second-line prescription.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, really good talk. Very clear. One thing I'm not sure we talked about, but was whether the original NOC trial itself was a superiority trial, but more probably it was actually a non-inferiority trial. And that's because he was trying to prove that a new drug isn't worse than an existing one. So that's quite a different question and null hypothesis, and depends on some non-inferiority margins that the FDA would have defined, which is like, anyway. Did we take that into account?
Yes.
Oh, shoot.
Yes, great. Yeah. So yes, I didn't say it. Yes, you're right. So Nogetsol is a non-inferiority target, and these lines here in red are the
non-inferiority margins.
non-inferiority
Okay.
margins.
Yeah, so it is important because it's just a different question, isn't it? So the target trial would be essentially a target non-inferiority trial as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, but you're very right. So maybe the way I should present it.
So I did think of it, or some of it.
Yeah. I think. Yeah.
But it's hard for the other thing I appreciated is, for those non-statisticians, we're taught that instrumental variables are natural randomizers. And maybe that's not a good metaphor for it, because you kind of think of a coin. And so that the instrumental variable could be a continuous variable isn't quite.
It's conditional. I would say it tries to emulate randomization, but it's conditional on the observable. So it's not. I will not describe it as a natural randomizer. So I would say conditional on all the observables, all the covariates that go in your model. What the instrument does is trying to make it as good as random.
So that is poor course I went to, got it wrong. Okay.
Conditions.
I actually also have a question. So I think for the theoretical part or for the case part, you are describing a very standardized, like the RCT setting. Like you have the treatment variables like a binary one. But what if our treatment is it's a categorical one, like treatment is a different levels, or it's even a continuous one? Can your method be generalized to this scenario?
Yes. My question. Yes. As long as you have a. Oh, sorry. No. I'll go back, because that's currently. I mean, if you want, what you want to use is a local IV. Right nowadays, it only works. The theory is only developed to the point where you can compare a binary treatment. We actually try to use it for the other component of the study, where we were emulating a 3 head-to-head trial, where we were comparing not only SUs, but also DPT4Is and SGLT2Is. But we could not actually use this local instrumental variable because the theory is not developed enough for considering categorical treatments. But what we did is we used a different instrumental variable approach. So instead of local IVs, we use two-stage residual inclusion. The reason being is, while two-stage residual inclusion cannot really account for heterogeneity, it does provide an average treatment effect, and then as opposed to the two-stage least squares. So basically, the short answer to your question is yes, we can do it, but not with the local IV. It has to be the two-stage residual inclusion.
But then, what?
The same instruments,
Yeah.
same instruments. The way we approach the econometrics is different, but the same instrument.
But then, what you are capturing is still the average treatment effect.
Exactly. So that's what we were very interested in. So we wanted to still identify an average treatment effect, but we knew that the theory was not, or the local instrumental variables is not developed to the point where it can allow for categorical treatments. So what we use is we still combined the target trial framework with instrumental variables, but we just use a different model of instrumental variables to stage residual inclusion. So basically, in the health economics paper, this is where it's this one. We use local IVs. In the BMJ paper, we use the two-stage residual inclusion. I'm happy to share the BMJ papers. I'm happy to read that. Same co-authors, it's just different comparisons and different econometrics approach.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Any more questions?
Sure, yeah, there's a couple of questions on the chat.
Okay, I will have them. Right. So perhaps we have two. I can see two questions. The first one is from Thomas. Thomas, if you're still online, can you just unmute yourself and then raise a question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the talk. My question was just around the target trial emulation component and how were the key eligibility criteria used to define the eligible and illegible populations determined that given that all trial criteria could be applied to the eligible population anyway. So was it based on some sort of ranking of how prognostic the criteria were of outcomes, or how was the priority given for those characteristics?
So if I understand correctly your question, and thanks for it. So what basically we did is we took this published RCT. We saw which were their eligibility criteria that they defined, and we basically applied those eligibility criteria in our study. In addition, because of course we have to have additional eligibility criteria to make it. Oh, thanks very much. So I'll show here. So here we compare which were used in the second column, which were used for the NACETO study, and that made our RCT eligibility population. But we needed additional inclusion criteria, basically this big box, that were not defined in the NOC, but because of the characteristics of an electronic health record, and in order to make this data or this cohort suitable for this kind of study, we needed to put certain additional conditions. For example, they needed to be registered, the GP practice, at least for a year, so that we can build the instruments. They needed, we allow for a window of time where they receive their last metformin, and which is, they already started with metformin, I forgot to say, and then when was the first prescription of their second line treatment. So that's how we basically define the eligibility criteria based on a published RCT plus additional eligibility criteria that had to be made or defined for making this cohort suitable for this study. Does that answer your question, Thomas?
Yeah, and I guess there's a lot of decisions made internally, right? At the CPRD, you don't have access to physician notes, so there may be some data that's not available that you would like to have in order to define some of the criteria. And so is the ineligible population then somebody who fails any of the target population criteria that you've started?
Exactly. So this applies for both the RCT eligible and ineligible. So but the rest. So basically, the target population is just the difference between, or the RCT ineligible population is the difference between the target population and the RCT eligible. So, for example, those that are not ineligible were those that were older or didn't meet the age restriction, or that for whom their baseline HbA1c was outside this range.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks.
Cool.
I think also there's another question from Bobby, and if Bobby is still online, you can also ask a question.
So I have a few questions, but my one question is about uncertainty. So you ended up with 5 times larger emulated trial, but a lot larger confidence interval as well there. So if you can comment, where is this uncertainty coming from? But also in this sensitivity analysis that where you used only inverse probability weighting for observables, what was the difference there in terms of uncertainty? Yeah, so where is this uncertainty coming from here? And yeah, how it compares with the other one.
Thanks, Bobby, for your question. So the uncertainty comes because I think it's well known in the IB literature that IB methods or instrumental variable methods are consistent. Well, if under the assumption that you have a valid instrument and the other assumptions are met, they are consistent or inefficient. Inefficient in terms of large standard errors, and it comes because we have to estimate two stages, right? First, we have, in this case, in the LIB, we have to estimate the propensity score, and then we introduce that propensity score in our second stage. So it has like 2 different uncertainties going on there. So that's why, and there's big literature why the instrumental variables are models or results are usually very uncertain. But yes, the IPTW, the uncertainty is much lower. So what I'm saying is in additional work that led by my colleague Steve O'Neill, we are trying to basically kind of combine the features of consistency from IBs and efficiency from IPTW or OLS in order to try to reduce in order to try to still be consistent, but reduce the uncertainty.
Okay,
So
no, that's what I thought. Yeah, that's what I thought was the case. And my other small question is instrumental variable. So if I understand correctly, it's the likelihood of being prescribers of DPP4. Was that? Sorry, I didn't hear much. You said something there, but I didn't hear it online. But if that is the case, then there is a plausible assumption that early adopters of newer interventions are likely to generally have better outcomes. So this assumption that the results might not, should not be determined by instrumental variable might be a bit sort of strong assumption there.
Yes, you're saying that there might be some young or some characteristics make doctors more prone to prescribe one or the other.
I mean, that generally people might fare better in this sort of practices because doctors are trying harder to do better job in terms of controlling their diabetes. So that's what I meant. But never mind. So I think we went out of time here. Sorry about that.
I will just answer quickly with, and maybe Amanda he can correct me. She knows better, way better, what goes in the clinical practice. But part of the issue is that there was a lot of uncertainty of which second line treatment was better than the other. So there was not a gold standard for second line treatment back then. And I think nowadays pretty much there's third class. There's a bit more of consensus amongst the diabetologists that SGLT2Is may offer more protection, but this doesn't on this paper. But at the time of the study, my understanding is that it was not that clear what DPP4Is or SUs were better because they have some risks, the risk for adverse events, for example, in SUs for hypoglycemic events was much higher. But so yeah, basically, it was not very there was a lot of uncertainty, which was better.
So Bobby, I think doctors that rush early with new treatments aren't necessarily better. They may assume that newer is better for drugs, but we know that it isn't necessarily. They may in fact have closer ties to the drugs industry, that they listen to drug reps. So it would be interesting to see whether the outcomes differ as a function of when someone moved. And so.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
The kind of, but I'm not sure.
That's
What is
associated
that?
with quality.
Yeah.
Okay.
And my other note is that it will be helpful to see the secondary outcomes, or at least those that you can derive from CPRD and other data there, because I mean, it just adds sort of richness to checking how consistent things are.
So this paper was a bit more methodological, but we do include a lot of secondary outcomes in the BMJ paper, which I'm very happy to share with Shuya, and maybe he can circulate a bit further.
Sure.
So in the BMJ paper, which follows the same similar methodological approach, same setting, well, difference that we do include a third class of drugs. We do include not only three classes, but we include more outcomes, including survival outcomes. So yes, happy to share that with you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and it was a great seminar. Thank you.
Okay, I think we are a bit running out of time, so I think we will stop here. Thank you again, David, for your presentation, and thanks everyone for your participation. And see you next time.
Yeah, thanks.